How's it going, everybody? My name's Chipper, and welcome back to another video on Escape from Tarkov. So in this video, I'm going to be talking about the in-game EFT settings that I use in order to maximize my FPS. In this guide, we're going to be talking about not only the in-game settings, but also settings that you can use outside with NVIDIA Control Panel. Then we'll also be diving into hardware choices, so builds where you can get probably the best bang for buck performance for EFT, specifically for EFT though. But we'll also discuss a wider range of different hardware, but then we'll also be diving into stream settings, so more specifically StreamFX, bit rates to be using and things like that. This is all stuff that I've gathered over the time that I've been playing Escape from Tarkov for over 4 years now, as well as being in the IT field, and also to recently becoming a partner on Twitch. I started streaming about 3 or 4 months ago, and I made an effort to try and learn as much as I possibly could about the effective bitrate that you can use in screen resolutions, and I ended up stumbling across quite a few different things that I wanted to share. So I'll try and make the most relevant stuff at the front, so game settings and FPS guide, then going down to hardware choices in case you're wanting to build a machine now, and what your options are in order to run EFT effectively and what you probably need to consider. And then we're going to be branching off into streaming sort of content, and as well as OBS and things like that. So stick around. I hope you guys really get a lot from this. I've been meaning to do this guide for a long time. I've had a lot of data stuff sitting here. Unfortunately, I was sick with my voice, so I wasn't able to do it, but I'm really glad to be able to do it now. Alrighty, so the first thing I want to talk to you guys about is the game tab. So in here, there's just 2 options down the bottom that you really need to worry about, and that's automatic RAM cleaner and your physical cores. So automatic RAM clean is mostly designed for like people with 8 gig of RAM. However, EFT's gotten to the point where really 16 gig is the minimum that you really want to be running. Even if you're running 16 gig, there may be the option to actually turn this on, but it can cause some issues. You'll get lag in menus, you potentially get some microstarters in RAID, and things like that. So be mindful. My recommendation here is to really try and run 32 gig of RAM. It will make your experience significantly better, especially if you're running dual rank mode in the memory. So we'll talk about that a bit later on though. When it uses physical cores, now this can vary. Even with you got hyper-threading, you really need to change and play around with this. It can really vary between AMD, between Intel. If you got older Intel, like 7700K for instance, even though it's got hyper-threading, turning this on and only using your 4 physical cores can actually net you a bonus here. So it's a mixed bag. I've seen different results even from the same CPU. So this is one that you really got to like change all your other settings, turn this on, give it a try, then restart the game by turning it off. Like turn it off, restart the game, come back in and see if you notice any difference in an offline factory RAID or something like that, or an online map that you've got consistent frames on that you could potentially tell the difference. But the chances are that there could be a very subtle change here. So, but food for thought. Crossing over to the graphics settings, I personally always run full screen. Even though I'm a streamer, my recommendation is to run full screen no matter what. It'll give you the most amount of latency, or lowest latency, but also the most amount of FPS. If you run borderless or Windows, you will take a fairly big hit, especially in borderless. I don't know why, but I can drop up to 20 frames, overall frames, by just running borderless. I don't know if that's just my machine, but it's pretty insane. So I always run full screen. When it comes to texture quality, guys, run high. I only drop this down to lower settings, in my opinion, if you're lacking VRAM on your video card. That's probably more so for older generation video cards, but you'd probably want to run, if you've got, say, under 8 gig, I would probably drop it down to medium, and then drop it down to low if you've got like a gaming laptop, which only got 4 or 6 or something like that. But just play around with that one, see how it performs, and then but that'd probably be my recommendation based on just on your RAM on your video card. Shadow quality, I would run low. In my opinion, this will obviously allow you to be more competitive because you can actually see players just that little bit better. It probably won't impact performance all that much on your system running either this low, medium, or high, so it is a bit of a user choice, but in my opinion, it still potentially can actually sap away some FPS, so I tend to just leave it on low. Then this will also allow you to run the lowest possible shadow visibility as well from the bar down the bottom here. LOD quality, I leave that at 2. I prefer to actually leave it at 2. But it's entirely up to you if you want to increase this, but increasing this one will potentially hurt your FPS. So that's just something to just be mindful of. Overall visibility. Now, in my opinion, you should never run over 1,000. If you're running over 1,000, there you potentially are sapping away FPS in the game. All that will do is potentially draw landmarks in the distance, which can be a benefit maybe early on if you're starting out. But as you've been playing EFT for a while, you don't need it. 1,000 overall visibility will allow you to see pretty much anywhere that you're able to shoot effectively due to the drop-off in the game. There's no point seeing any further than that because it's not going to hurt your, I guess, aesthetics of the game with the draw distance. And it'll also allow you just to see the majority of the map then when you're going to snipe, say, over 400 meters. If you drop it down to the 400 meter mark, which I believe that's what the draw is, or at least close to, then you'll actually start to see on maps like Woods that you'll see white just drawn in the distance where the map just stops rendering. And it looks really funky. And in my opinion, if you can avoid it, try and stay over 1,000. But if you are struggling for FPS, maybe drop this to 400 and see how it goes. When it comes to anti-aliasing, I run TAA. I find this to be the best. It does add a bit of gloss, but in saying that though, it does, because of the gloss and the way it sort of smooths over the edges and stuff like that, it does appear to, in my opinion, to be the best looking. You can run FXAA, but it will be jagged as all hell. It will give you the most amount of FPS though. The only option that I'd recommend using FXAA is if you're on like an old school gaming laptop or something and you're just trying to actually play the game. Whereas you wouldn't be, if you can't run this setting, if you had to go up to TAA, the game would be unplayable, then dropping down to FXAA would probably be the best option in this case. Resampling, I would just leave it 1 times. You can drop that down if you're running higher reses, but you're better off just changing the resolution. HBAO I'd leave off. SSR I would leave off as well. That's like for water reflections and stuff like that. Obviously, in my opinion, there's just not really any solid water reflections in Escape from Tarkov to really enable that one. Now, anisotropic filtering. This one's a bit a personal preference in a way. I run this off. I don't really notice all that much difference with it. You will notice a difference by running per texture, especially per texture and then on. There are some NVIDIA settings that you're going to have to change if you want to run this, because there's certain settings that you're probably better off changing, which will probably help in this situation. But if you're leaving this one off, I would only turn it to per texture if you're, I think, in my opinion, when you're sniping long range, it'll really help clear up the image, especially in the further distance. So if you're a bit of a sniper, you might prefer to use per texture. But that, like I said, that's personal preference again. But if you want to probably get the most FPS you can, I'd probably leave that one off. Now, NVIDIA Reflex low latency. Should you run this? Yes, 100%. It effectively means that your render queue from your CPU to your GPU is always empty. It's never bottlenecking. What that means is because it's never bottlenecking, that means you get the best input lag / system latency you possibly get with your hardware. Now, this is specifically important for older hardware, which probably struggle more so with system latency and input lag than, say, a newer hardware or users running, say, 3000 NVIDIA cards and stuff like that. So definitely, if you have an NVIDIA card, run this on. Now, if you don't do any NVIDIA control panel changes, always put this onto on and boost. Boost will just put maximum power management control within your NVIDIA control panel for you, rather than you having to actually do it manually. So that'll tax your card harder and push your card to the maximum power limit that it can draw. So that way it's got the best chance of getting the best system latency and input lag. But that's pretty much all it does. It does help you potentially give you an edge, especially on older graphics cards, older NVIDIA graphics cards. Potentially makes you more competitive against people with newer tech. So definitely enable that. At least turn this to on at the bare minimum. I should say though that you will get an FPS hit by enabling this though. It does use resources to run it. And yeah, you may run, depending on your machine, maybe 5 to 10 FPS, depending on how high your FPS is on your machine. You may not notice it all that much by like 2 or 3 frames, or you may even see up to 10 frames lost. Now, when it comes to sharpness, this one is personal preference. It's what you'd prefer to run. I prefer to run 1.5. I'm as a streamer, I probably shouldn't be running this high. However, I do have custom NVANC settings via my encoder, via StreamFX plugin to run a little bit more sharpness. I can kind of get away with it, but I want to run more sharpness for my recordings for YouTube. So I got to find this balance between what looks good on YouTube and what looks good on Twitch. But like I said, this is personal preference. You may find 1.0 is good enough for you, or you may like 2.0. After 2.0 though, you may find it a bit too sharp, especially if you use painkillers. So if you're finding that it's a bit hard to look at on the screen, maybe dial it back down until you find that sweet spot. When it comes down to these other two options, so FPS lobby and game FPS, I always max those ones out. That doesn't really matter too much because you will be running uncapped, and I'll show you about that later on how to actually achieve that. Now, just to go back to NVIDIA Reflex low latency. In order to enable this, you will need to have in NVIDIA Control Panel your VSync option turned off, and also the VSync option in-game turned off, and then you want to enable it in NVIDIA Reflex to on or at least on boost. That will enable the limit. You'll know when NVIDIA Reflex is working. You'll see the infinity symbol if you go FPS. If you go FPS 1 in your console, you'll see the infinity symbol at the very top when you're in a raid. That's when you know NVIDIA Reflex is working. Otherwise, if you're still capped at 61 or 60 FPS with NVIDIA Reflex on, it's not working correctly. The other thing is down the bottom here, guys, with the coloring and all these other options. So high color, high quality color you don't need. Z-Blow I'd only run if you're a streamer and you want a little bit more bitrate, because it will blur out your weapon a little bit and it may help you stream a little bit, but that's pretty much the only people that would be using that. Chrome aberrations keep off, noise keep off, grass shadows definitely keep off. That one's brutal. Now MIP streaming can help you if you got older systems. Effectively, it puts more load. In this case, it puts more. Potentially, I believe it puts more load on the CPU rather than GPU. But you will just need to play around with this. I've seen not much benefit, if not worse, performance when activating this. I think it really comes down to how old your hardware is when it comes to this one. So just something to just be mindful of. This is one of those other settings that I'd say I'd play around with. Once you got all your other settings changed, this is one of those ones where I'd play around with and see if it makes any difference. Offline factory rate is really good in this instance to potentially test this out. However, you will have to run uncapped frames if you've got a fairly beefy machine, because obviously you'll hit your refresh rate pretty easily with NVIDIA Reflex on. Now the flash indicator, that's more designed for screens which have the new technology built into it, which is the Reflex analyzer. You'll need to have an actual specific monitor to actually utilize this, or you'll need to have like something actually put on your screen that you can get that identifies the flash indicator when you use software, like I guess external software, and then that will actually give you a system response time. But some screens are actually coming out with it. They're the more expensive screens. You're looking at, I guess, 1200 USD plus or 1000 USD plus, I think they start at. So about 1500 in Australia before you start getting sort of software that actually has it inbuilt into the monitor. And then you can activate this flash indicator with NVIDIA Reflex and actually get real-time sort of results without having to buy external hardware. So, which is pretty cool. And that should become more mainstream as time goes on. But yeah, the fact that EFT's got it now is pretty damn cool. Now, when it comes to post effects, guys, I don't run them. I don't like them. I don't like the fact that as soon as I enable post effects here, even though I haven't changed any of the settings, I lose FPS. It applies obviously some form of filter as soon as I enable it. And I've seen it multiple times. I've lost frames just by enabling post effects. So I'm not too sure if it has to do something in order to enable it, but I just don't like the fact that I lose frames. It's not much frames, and in my opinion, if this helps you see people better, then definitely run it. It won't hurt. It won't hurt that much. You're looking at between 5 to 15 frames overall. The big ones that are going to hurt you the most is going to be clarity, luma sharpen, and adaptive sharpen. They're going to be your main three. These ones here. That if you're running these will hurt your FPS. If you're a streamer, for the love of God, do not use luma sharpen. Luma sharpen will butcher your Twitch stream. So that's just something to be mindful of. Try and avoid using that like the plague. You can use adaptive sharpen a little bit in clarity, but you're going to have to drop your overall sharpness in your previous window down significantly. And I would only choose one or the other. I'd use either the sharpen in here or the sharpen in the graphics settings, but don't double stack them because you just don't know how sharpen, the different types of sharpening is being applied. So you want to avoid sharpen as much as possible on Twitch, ideally, depending on the resolution and the bitrate that you're running at. Other than that, guys, that's, like I said, that's, in my opinion, that's personal preference. If you want to enable that, go right ahead. Yeah, one more thing I did want to add, guys, here is that you probably realized I'm running a different resolution here. I'm actually running 1 pixel less from 1440p. I'm running 1439. Now, the reason for that is there was an issue back in the day where the refresh rate was not actually applying to your monitor's refresh rate, and in order to unlock it, you actually had to run 1 pixel less in Escape from Tarkov by creating a custom resolution. So this is actually a custom resolution that I can run, but I still have my original one here. Now, you don't have to do this anymore. I do believe they have fixed it, but they haven't fixed it in the config file, and that's what concerns me the most, the fact that my config file doesn't reflect the refresh rate that my monitor can run or the refresh rate that I want to run. And that's the reason why I still run this setting. I found that when running, now, and like I said, this could be personal preference, but I found when running at 1440p with NVIDIA Reflex on, it felt janky. It just didn't feel right. It felt better than what it does without NVIDIA Reflex, but it just still didn't feel right. The only time that it felt really good and really responsive is when I use the custom resolution. So I will be talking about that later after the NVIDIA Control Panel segment. If you guys want to go down that path, you're more than welcome to. Try it out and see if you notice a difference. Otherwise, look, if you don't want to dive into it, just stay at your native resolution, whatever that is, activate NVIDIA Reflex, and you should have a fairly good performance. Alrighty, guys, and now the next thing we're going to dive into is actually NVIDIA Control Panel. Now, the first thing I probably want you to jump into is manage 3D settings. So jump into here, go to program settings. We're actually going to add Escape from Tarkov. Go to the add button, browse until you find your executable wherever it's installed, click on it, and then actually add it in. Once you've added it in, that means you're only going to be making changes towards NVIDIA Control Panel for Escape from Tarkov and not globally to any game. So make sure you definitely do this before changing any of the settings here and don't get caught out. Some of the settings for Escape from Tarkov do not apply to other games. Okay, so let's just go down the list. So image sharpening, you definitely want that off. You've got sharpening in the game, you best to use that. You can use that if you want. You may get some visual improvement there, but it's personal preference. If you're a streamer or content creator, it's probably a no-go. Anisotropic filtering, leave that as application controlled. That's fine because you can do it in-game. Anisotropic FXAA, leave that off. Anti-aliasing gamma correction, leave that one on. Anti-aliasing mode, leave that application controlled. Again, it's something that you'd rather change in-game rather than force it off outside of the game. Anti-aliasing anti-aliasing transparency, leave that one off as well. Background application, max frame rate, turn that one to off. CUDA cores for your GPU, obviously turn that one to on. Now, low latency mode, that was the first iteration that they did, which is pretty much now NVIDIA Reflex. So leave this one off. Putting this to ultra did potentially hurt your frames, made the game a bit more consistent in terms of its input latency and lag. However, it did drop your frames considerably. So that's something that I'd leave off in case it just has any effect with running both NVIDIA Reflex and ultra low latency mode. Max frame rate, leave this off. This one's a really good one, really, from I guess a competitive standpoint for input lag. We're just trying to get as many frames as we can. But in saying that, though, this was more designed for, I guess, games which can really push high frame rates, like esports titles. That's where that one really comes in. But for Escape from Tarkov, just leave that one off. When it comes to G-Sync or monitor technology, just obviously run G-Sync or whichever one equivalent that you have. Multi-frame sample AA, leave that one off. Open render GPU, obviously select your current one. If you're one of the lucky guys that can still run SLI, or you got more cash than God, you probably need to run EFT in just one GPU. It will probably not like SLI at all. It is not, a lot of games don't really benefit from SLI, and it actually will hinder your performance or cause the game to crash or have issues. So if you are having that problem with SLI, Make sure you're only running one GPU as your main. Power management mode. Now, prefer maximum performance is what I would recommend, because it'll always push your card to the limit, and give it, and obviously hit it to the maximum power draw, just to try and give it the most amount of power when it needs it. This isn't probably the end of the world for Escape from Tarkov in a sense, because we really, depending on the video card that you got, will really depend if you'll get benefit from this. Because if you have like a 2000 card, like a mid, like say 2080 Ti, you've got like a 3060 Ti or better, even a 1080 Ti, like a lot of those cards, you'll probably got more than enough power and CUDA cores to run the game in its normal configuration. But prefer maximum performance will always just make sure that your card is ready, it is able to accept what's coming at it, and it will just give it the best possible opportunity to push as hard as it possibly can. Just be mindful that that could mean more heat as well. Preferred refresh rate, just go highest available. Shader cache, leave that one on. Anisotropic, so texture filtering, anisotropic sample, I'll leave that one on. Now, when it comes to texture filtering, negative LOD bias. Now, this one is one that I would actually look at potentially just leaving on allow. If you are actually running anisotropic filtering within the game, that's potentially where I'd be changing this one. If you're running like per textures, for instance, I'd actually be running clamp. If you're running clamp and you're not running anisotropic filtering, there's no reason to be running clamp. Just put it on allow. It even says it here down the bottom there. You'd be better off going for allow, which will give you the higher performance. When it comes to texture filtering quality, I go high performance. Now, you could potentially run this in quality or high quality mode. It's just up to you. I prefer to go high performance just to try and get as much FPS as possible in Escape from Tarkov. And I find that I get many compliments that the game still looks great. So in my opinion, definitely push this one to high performance. Texture filtering, try linear optimization. I leave that one on. That should be for better, higher performance. Now, threaded optimization, obviously for multiple CPUs, in my opinion, just leave this on auto. Just let it auto detect whether or not you've got multi threads on your CPU. It's entirely up to you, but in my opinion, there was a guy called Lowe's is Back, and he actually identified that in the Unity code that there was an issue here where it potentially wasn't using all the threads. And they have made changes that if you've got this on auto now, it should be using either your cores that you have available or the total amount of cores that you've got through all the threads. So definitely leave this on auto. You can change it if you want, but it's just not worth it. When it comes to triple buffering, leave that one off. Vertical sync is off. Now that's probably the big one here, especially just from a competitive FPS side of things, from system latency and input lag. Is definitely leave this one off because you want to enable NVIDIA Reflex in-game. That's obviously if you've got an NVIDIA card. Now, virtual reality pre-rendered frames, leave this on as 1 as well. Is my opinion, that's going to be the best application there, and that's been the best one tested in the past. And that's pretty much it for here, guys. Now, if you do want to run post effects settings, but you don't want to run the in-game ones, I actually go down to adjust desktop color settings, and I change my gamma up to 1.2 and I change my digital vibrance up to 70. Now you could copy this if you'd like, but you're going to get different results depending on the monitor you use. I always find it amusing where people are shown post effect settings that they should be using, but that's completely irrelevant because of the different monitors. Everyone has different color grading on their monitor. Different color, like they could be running sRGB, they could be, who knows what settings they could have. They could have sharpness up to 10 for all we know. So adding more sharpness via the post effects makes the game even look worse or better. It just, you never know. You really, when it comes to post effect settings and digital vibrance and settings, either in post effects or NVIDIA Control Panel, change it so it looks good for your eyes and your setup. Don't copy someone's settings. You copy someone's settings, I guarantee you're going to apply it and you're going to be like, I don't like this. Or you're going to force yourself to use it just because someone else had it. Don't do that. Change the settings so that it actually looks good so that you get the benefit of what you're after. If you're looking to try and get to see people better. Maybe you need a little bit less gamma or a little bit more gamma, or maybe you need a little bit more digital vibrance to see, you know, to make the game look that little bit more colorful so that it's not as dreary in certain situations. Tailor it towards what you want. If you want the competitive edge, then obviously aim for that. Otherwise, if you just want to make the game look just that little bit better, these are the settings that I run, and it seems to work well for me. But like I said, try and just edit these, maybe these two here, and see if you can find a nice sort of balance. All right, and finally, the last thing I want to talk about is that custom resolution that I was running. In case you guys wanted to run it, this is the section that I'd actually go down here. I would actually then end up going down to the customize section, and then you need to actually run a custom setting. So you just go create a custom resolution, drop it down to 39, and then Bob's your uncle. You save that, test it. Obviously, make sure the refresh rate is whatever your monitor is, and then that's the custom resolution. Like I said, this probably isn't required. Once it's ticked too, just make sure it's ticked, but you don't select it obviously for your desktop resolution. You only select it in game. Now, once you have done that though, you want to definitely go down here to where it says your monitor. So the monitor that you changed it on, adjust desktop size and positioning. Make sure no scaling is enabled for the monitor that you're going to be using as your main gaming monitor. You don't want to do aspect ratio, because what aspect ratio will do is it'll try and stretch out that 1 pixel and try and cover the whole screen. And that could potentially add some blurriness and stuff like that. No scaling will mean it'll just draw the actual res that you've selected. You may get a slight line down the left-hand side, or at least on my machine, occasionally, but in-game you don't notice it or anything like that. The only time I've ever seen any issues there is by not running no scaling, like running aspect ratio or full screen. So that's just something to just be mindful of. So that's the reason why I still do it. Now, the reason why I'm still doing that is because of the local config file. So if I actually go here, open file location. Now in my PC documents, escape from Tarkov, you'll actually find your local config file. Now that local config file will bring up your settings in game in a text format. This is really good that if you want to make changes to your game, especially if you're a streamer, because there could be instances where like, hey, I'm playing labs or factory tonight and I'm exclusively doing it. I can run a bit more sharpness because there's going to be no grass. So, and I want the game to look just that little bit better. So I can actually pump up like 1.5 sharpness rather than 1.0 or 0.7. But the biggest thing is here is this is where you actually change. You can change your resolution here, and then you can force the refresh rate. Now, if you're running your native full screen, you'll notice that this will not match your refresh rate. You'll get like answers like 59, 23. You'll get random numbers. Now, in saying that, just because it doesn't have your refresh rate there, doesn't mean that it's not doing it in game. But I've noticed some weird stuff. I swear that when I force it here and I run the custom resolution, the game just feels like it runs better. Could just be my machine, could just be my rig, but that's just what I use. And if you want to give it a go and see how you compare, go ahead and see what you get the results from running your native to the custom res and see if you notice any difference. But you will need to come in here and change your resolution to whatever your refresh rate is. The advantage you've got in here too is there's a few things that you can change. Now, HDR, you can change to 0. I'm not entirely sure if the HDR color, it does anything or hurts performance at all, unless you're actually running in HDR mode, but I would just turn that off to be on the safe side. This is where, like I said, you can change a lot. Now, if you save any settings in Escape from Tarkov, post-effects settings, your graphics settings, bloom will be turned back on. You can't turn it back off. The only way you can turn bloom off is if you come into here and turn it to 0 and save it and relaunch the game again. You got to have the game quit out. You got to actually exit the game in order to change the setting as well. This is the only way that I can see turning off bloom. Now, I'm not entirely sure. I know bloom, I think, used to be in the game. It used to help out with like the factory tunnels. Seeing down towards the end would be very blurred out and be very hard to see someone. But turning this to 0 used to then light it up like a Christmas tree. But I don't think that's the case anymore. I'm not entirely sure if bloom's just out of the game because there's no setting for it actually in Escape from Tarkov. So that's just something to be mindful of. I've tried testing this, and to be honest, I don't really notice the difference. So if it is on 1, it's not the end of the world. I don't think it's like the good old days, but look, I just want to mention it in case you guys do want to try it out and see any differences. It's there. But this is pretty much a cool thing where you can change some of the settings before you actually load the game, in case you want to make changes without having to enter in and out of the game, make the changes, quit back out. You can do it before you even load the game. And I always check this too to make sure bloom's off, HDR off, and any of the other settings like the sharpness is what I want to use before I start streaming is all ready to go here, and everything looks hunky-dory. Alrighty, now the next things I want to touch on after you've gone through NVIDIA settings is probably right-clicking on your launcher for Escape from Tarkov, going Open File Location. Now go back one folder from the launcher down to Battlestate Games and into EFT. This will show you your Escape from Tarkov.exe. Just make sure it's not the _BE. That is obviously for BattleEye. You want to be just doing the Escape from Tarkov. Make sure you right-click, Properties, go to Compatibility Mode, change high DPI settings, click that, enable the override high DPI scaling behavior and change that to application. That will definitely help out with frames, especially when you're using scopes in Escape from Tarkov, and give you a bit of an edge. The other thing that I'd probably recommend doing is making sure your game mode is enabled. This used to be a thing where turning it off would actually gain you more FPS because it wasn't functioning properly, but it actually does benefit you now. So that's just something to be mindful of as well. Make sure that one's running. The other thing I'd want to touch on, guys, is probably a big one that I always do too, is make sure that you use some form of like Windows optimization guide. Now, I actually really like the work that Tech Yes City does. He comes up with some really good optimization guides, which turns a lot of the junk that Windows 10 has now. Windows 10 has really, Windows 10 when it first came out was really cut back, and it was fantastic, especially for gaming. Over time with the new versions like 1909, we got 2002 now, and even further on, there's been more and more added onto Windows, which potentially is an extra features and services which slow down your machine. So definitely consider running the most recent guide that you'll feel comfortable going through to turn off a lot of settings which you probably don't use. If you're going through the guide, you don't have to follow it to the T. If you feel like there's something that you may use, just keep it on. But turn any of the other stuff off that you're definitely not going to use. You probably will see a benefit. And this is one of the first things I do with any new build. Okay, and lastly, guys, the next thing I want to talk about is, again, about input lag, and that is your DPI settings. I highly recommend that you at least run 1600 DPI, as running 400 or 800 DPI, which seems to be a bit common for a lot of users, could actually be giving you increased input lag. This has actually been recently documented, and a video created by Battle Nonsense. Some of you guys maybe remember him when he actually did an actual analysis of the ping and refresh rate and latency within Escape from Tarkov a while back. And he's actually got a guide here which actually shows you the difference between running low DPI versus high DPI with the DefAdder V2 mouse, which is relatively new. Funny enough, it's actually the mouse that I actually have. And he actually shows that if you run at least 1600 DPI, it actually can be of benefit to you. So just something to just be mindful of here. I probably recommend actually looking into this one. And if you find that you don't like obviously the sensitivity, you can always drop it in game. So drop it in game to get the feeling of 400 or 800 as long as you can, and then try and have at least 1600 with your mouse, and then you should at least get the best possible input latency that you can. Going higher, obviously, going higher will obviously have benefits, but the tipping point is definitely 1600. Diminishing returns kicks in hard after 1600. All right, now I want to touch on hardware. Now this is a bit of a delicate one. I will try and sum this up as best as I can. This is going to be a pretty long one, but this will be important if you're looking to buy a new machine or for maybe some key upgrades in order to get the most out of Escape from Tarkov. So the first machine we're looking at is a Ryzen 5 5600X. Now, really good single core performance. The 5000 series from AMD really made up for the fact of this lacking of single core performance on the 3000 series. Not that the 3000 series was necessarily lacking, it just wasn't performing as well as Intel, but they completely smashed it out of the park with the 5000 series. Really good CPU for the price. It is only 6 cores, so if that's important to you, but for gaming at the moment, especially for EFT, that's more than enough. Now, when it comes to the cooler, any like 240 or 280 rad will be more than enough to keep this beast cool. Now, the reason why I would recommend at least getting a 240 Brad, like this EK or a Corsair brand, which is the two popular ones that I'd recommend, just because of their warranties, is because of Precision Boost Overdrive. Now, Precision Boost Overdrive is how the 5000 series sort of clocks itself up for single core performance, or clocks all cores up when multi-cores are required. But what you can do is something called a negative curve undervolt. Now, what that means is that you're actually going into Ryzen Master software and finding your CCXs, and then finding the first 6 cores, in case, I guess, the first 3 or first 6 cores for the actual CPU, and then finding the 2 best cores. So as you can see in Ryzen Master, it puts a star for the best and a silver little star symbol for the second best, and you're looking for those, and then you actually undervolt all your other cores, except you only put a very mild undervolt on your 2 best cores. What Precision Boost Overdrive does then is it actually will give you a slight bonus, because you've got more headroom by causing the undervolt on the actual other cores, and then you're increasing the power limits, and then that will result in Precision Boost Overdrive being able to work harder. Of course, this will potentially generate more heat, or at least you need to keep the machine as cool as possible, so Precision Boost Overdrives will boost higher. And this can actually result in not only higher multi-core performance, but significant boost in single core and reduce in temperatures. So it's actually crazy, the fact that it's completely opposite to Intel. I'll link this document. This only really focuses on the 5900X, but there's other guides out there that will run through certain settings. Now, you probably can't do this as much an undervolt on the 5600X, but you still can do it, and your results may vary. But it is, once you get into the BIOS and have a quick fiddle and read a few guides, it really isn't that scary. It's not like Intel, or it's not like overclocking back in the day. Motherboards really have a lot of safety features in place so that you can't really cock up a lot of things. Of course, do it at your own risk. I don't take responsibility if you go do it, but I highly recommend you look into it and you do it early and don't do it later. Enjoy having a machine running at peak performance and getting the most bang for buck early rather than 1 to 2 years later. Also, this is future chipper, guys, because I actually just remembered that I didn't mention the motherboard. But the motherboard we're going to be using is the MSI X570 Tomahawk. Now, I will be mentioning this board even from the Intel machine, and I will be highly recommending MSI motherboards. Look, it's personal preference here. You can go Gigabyte Master, just make sure it's a revision 1.2. You can go Asus Gaming F and Gaming E, or even their Crossfire edition, and then moving up from there. You can even go the MSI Unify, and then going even to Godlike if you've got more money than God. And then, yeah, so there is some decent motherboards out there that you can consider. But the Tomahawk X570 is an amazing motherboard for the price. It covers all the basics that you're going to need with insane VRM performance. Some of the VRM performance on this motherboard is almost on par with boards that are $500 to $700 Australian. And this board you can get this board as cheap as $270 in Australia right now. Insane value for what this motherboard packs. And for the most average user out there, unless you're missing features that you're looking for on the motherboard, and you need to upgrade from there, I would just go with the Tomahawk. You're probably not really going to find a better bang for buck motherboard for the AMD platform. But like I said, if it's features that you're after and it's lacking those features, just go for the more upgraded model. MSI Unify is a great board. You can then go, the Gigabyte Master is an insanely good motherboard, especially if you really want to run really high-end RAM. So that's just something to be mindful of too. The other thing I want to sort of touch on here too, guys, is when it comes to RAM, make sure that when you're going for 32 gig, the reason why you're wanting to do that is for dual rank mode. So for instance, if you're only by one stick here of 16 gig, that is single rank mode, which like one little worker will be going backwards and forwards reading the RAM. However, if you run another stick of RAM of 16 gig, so another kit here, where you end up being 32 gig, you'll cover all 4 of the DIMM slots on your motherboard. That will enable dual rank mode, which means you'll have 2 workers going between your RAM sticks, and that will actually give you an 8 to 10% FPS performance boost in Escape from Tarkov, and that can equate to about 10 to 20 FPS overall. Combined with an overclock, that can lead to significant bonuses between both of these being enabled. So it's just something to just be mindful of, okay? So if you go above 32 gig and go to 64, you will lose this advantage. A lot of people seem to buy like crazy fast RAM, but then they buy 64 gig and they lose the benefits of the bonus that you get from running dual rank at 32 gig because they're taxing their memory controller. The workers have to work twice as hard because you've got more RAM. They're potentially also running sticks which have 8 gig on both sides of their sticks, which means there's a heat issue as well. So the RAM is extremely expensive. It has to have very high tolerance to heat because of to potentially the amount of volts or the voltage that they got to run. And they're just things that they have to be mindful of. So, but yes, if you want to get more FPS and hit the sweet spot, 32 gig is where it's at with dual rank. So you can either get that by running 2x16 kits, or you can run it by using 2 kits of 2x8 like I've got here. Moving on from there is RAM. Now, RAM is an interesting one. With Ryzen, the sweet spot is 3600 if you want ultimate compatibility. You buy pretty much any RAM stick of the same type, up to about 32 gig. A 3600 will get you the majority of performance from an AMD machine. Now, here I've got some G-Skill Ripjaws, the non-RGB. They're very cheap. You can even, this is obviously Australian price. You can get this even cheaper if you're in USA. And then, yeah, so these are the RAM sticks that I'd recommend. Now, these are a 16, 19, 19 bin. They are Samsung B-die, but they're obviously not as, with the timings being 16, 19, 19, that's probably not the best bin. But in saying that though, from an XMP perspective, like you just plug it in, set the XMP profile, or whatever the equivalent is in AMD, and then away you go. You're not planning to overclock or change anything on these sort of RAM timings or anything. This is just plug and play RAM and away you go. When it comes to storage, Samsung 980 Pro is obviously a Gen 4 PCI Express. Really fast. Like, it's getting to the point now where you don't even see Windows load at all, and that's even with applications and everything loaded up. When you're restarting and you've got your machine up and running, yeah, you literally don't even see the Windows logo. It's crazy. Now, when it comes to video cards, now I have got the 3060 in this build, and that's equivalent to about a 2070 Super to 2080, depending on the game you're playing. And that's because of the GPU shortage at the moment. It may be worth actually forking out the money to actually buy a 3060 rather than a second-hand card. It really depends if you can get a second-hand card that's like a 2080 or maybe a 1080 Ti can probably be enough at the moment. But you obviously miss out on some of the newer features that come out with the 3000 card. If you've got a 2070 Super or higher in the 2000 series, you've got a 1080 Ti, or you've got a 3000 card, then obviously you're pretty good. If you're under that, so if you've got like a 260, you can still play EFT, but your frames are going to hurt. It just doesn't have the CUDA cores to run EFT effectively. In my opinion, like to get high frames, there are going to be points where your frames will dip below what I'd call satisfactory, and it can potentially get you killed. So that's the entry level. You're looking at about 3,500 CUDA cores on average. And if you can pump up above 3,500 CUDA cores, you should be pretty damn good in Escape from Tarkov. That hitting around 5,000 CUDA cores would probably be the peak of what EFT really benefits from. There's been numerous guys that have bought 2080 Ti's and then they've gone to the 3090 and they've seen no difference at all in Escape from Tarkov. I went from a 8700K with 32 gig of 3400 and a 1080 Ti, and I put my 1080 Ti in my new 5000 series 5900X with like undervolted and also heavily clocked up and dropped down RAM. So the megahertz on the RAM was 3733 and the timings were dropped crazy. So it's like 13, 15, 14, 31T. And I probably saw a jump on the 1080 Ti by about 10 to 15 frames. So there was an improvement there, but the bottleneck at that stage was really just the 1080 Ti, but it was still hitting 100% utilization. So going to the 3080 wasn't a huge jump. So it was more the combination of the new machine and the video card, which really skyrocketed me up in terms of overall FPS and EFT. But that was only because I was running a 1080 Ti as well. Now, when it comes to the case, Phanteks is the one I'd recommend, but just get a high flow air case, in my opinion. Just a high flow mesh case that's available now. There's a lot of different brands out there now. I just put Phanteks in. That's the one I went for with my build, but you don't have to. Pick whatever you're after, depending on the radiator that you're purchasing and things like that. Just make sure it's all compatible, and then go from there. But you definitely check out the high airflow cases if you're not planning to water cool. When it comes to power supply, there was one brand that I love, and that's Corsair. Corsair have lasted multiple machines for me. They have crazy warranties. I think Corsair is just one of those things where it's like you get a Corsair power supply, you know it's going to work, and it's going to work for what they've listed it as, and you'll get a decent warranty with it as well. So this has only just got an 850 watt power supply, so that should be more than enough for this build, and for the most part that will be. I'd probably end up going up to 1000 watts if you've got like a 3080 or more, because some of those cards have 3 8-pins and they can push 450, 500 watts depending on the BIOS and everything that you've got on there. All right, now the second build that I'd be considering, now this is the upgraded build. Now this is the build I'd probably be leaning towards. You're starting to hit the point where this is the build where you're going to be starting to get a lot of your performance in Escape from Tarkov, like as in you're starting to, it's the next level above the 5600 build, and that's the 5800. Now the 5800X, while it may not have the best silicon for its two CCXs, it will have the advantage of the fact that it's only cooling 8 cores, and it's not cooling 12 cores or 16 cores compared to the next upgrades above, so the 5900X and the 5900X. Sorry, 5900X and 5950X, sorry. In this case, though, because you would be getting significant advantage by doing the undervolt, you obviously want to upgrade the cooler to as beefy as you can go. So going like a 360 maybe, if you can, even venturing into water cooling here if you want. The board would have to be changed, though, if you're probably going to go down the water cooling route. So that's something to just be mindful of. But same again, the Tomahawk is still a great board. Now, this RAM looks the same, but it's actually Samsung B-Die relatively good bin. So it's a 16 primary timings kit, and in my opinion that's really good, because you may be able to have a little bit of overclocking headroom here. So that's just something to just be mindful of. I think it's worth it. There are some kits that are a little bit better than this, that you do need to have an understanding of overclocking your RAM and obviously reducing the primaries, and knowing how much heat your actual RAM is going to generate and things like that, how much power you're pushing through them and how much tolerance they're going to cope with. But for the most case, this is sort of like plug and play. You can then run at 3600 and maybe drop some of the primary timings by 1 or 2 notches, and then see how you go. There's even tools online that can help you out with that, and then yeah, go down those paths and look into it as well. Now, obviously, most of this build stays the same. Obviously, we've upgraded to 1000 watt here, but we are going to an RTX 3070. Look in your region, the RTX 3070 and the Ti could be very similar price. You could probably get an RTX 3070 Ti for the same price as the 3070. So in this case here in Australia, I think it's another $80 more to get the Ti over the 3070. And in this case, this is an EVGA Ultra gaming one too. So in my opinion, for the win variant. So why not get that for an extra $80 compared to a normal 3070, which was actually nowhere near probably the capacity and quality that the EVGA one was. So this was a very entry level 3070. So that's just something to just be mindful of. Make sure you're checking out what the different specs are and prices are in your region. It's going to vary here, but the 3070 and the 3070 Ti are like, you're not really going to get much more performance. You go 3080 or 3090, you're really not going to gain much FPS in Escape from Tarkov. You will in a lot of other titles, but not really that much in Escape from Tarkov. You're really starting to hit the peak of what the current video cards generation can do in terms of gain FPS at the moment. Now that is a caveat to the current Unity engine. If we go to another Unity engine, which there's planned to be relatively soon, there could be performance improvements here, or there could be performance negatives here because new features come into the game that they've never been able to implement before due to the new Unity engine, and that could hinder performance. So we may gain some FPS but then lose it on another feature. So it just depends on what comes out and what actually ends up unfolding there. Alrighty, now we're going to be talking about the Intel machine. So there's going to be obviously some differences here. In my opinion, this machine here is actually probably better bang for buck than the AMD machine, even though I would probably recommend going the AMD side. If you're just trying to get the best bang for buck machine possible, the 10 series from Intel is probably the way to go, especially the 10700KF. In terms of just getting a solid CPU that can overclock to 5.1 gig, has 8 cores, hyper-threading, really the option for really fast RAM to be run on it. You do miss out on upgradability though, but in terms of current gen and being able to get the core basics of what you're after in order to put all the rest of the money into the GPU, this is probably something that you should heavily consider, especially if you're looking at your machine. So the i7 10700KF is a really good bargain. 8 cores. The F means that it's not got integrated GPU, or APU I should say. So that you will need a video card, even a cheap one, in order to just obviously have some form of visual. But as you can see here, this card, or at least, this chip is very similar price to the 5600X, but that's only a 6-core versus an 8-core. But overall though, the performance difference really isn't huge. When you look at game statistics between the two CPUs, they're very similar priced. So obviously if you need the extra cores, this could be something to consider. The good thing about it is you just need, in order to push 5 gig or even 5.1, you could get away with a 240 or even a 280 rad quite easily. You don't need to go up to the 360. But this game, again, I would probably stick with EK or Corsair there just for their warranties. The MSI Z490 Tomahawk, again, very similar in terms of the VRM performance that you're going to be getting from the AMD board, from the X570. Like I said, you still can go Asus Gaming E and F, Gigabyte Master. I think there's even the Gigabyte's Aurorus Ultra, I think is meant to be a good motherboard as well. But the same again, if you're missing features, and then just look at reviews and then just make sure that it's going to be performing quite well, especially VRM cooling as well, because the idea is that you should overclock this machine. It is an Intel machine. As long as you cool it, feed it more power, it will overclock all cores rather than just have your first cores boosting to, I think 4.7 or 4.8, I think this one does. Whereas you want to push at least 5 gig on all cores to really get the benefit. The benefit of overclocking even just on my 8700K, which is an old 6-core Intel machine, to 5 gigahertz from its default was insane. I was getting between 10 to 20%, 10 or 20 frames lower when I wasn't running my overclock, which is crazy. So the extra performance you can get, especially in single core performance and Escape from Tarkov on the Intel machine, is insane. So I highly recommend, if you're going to go the Intel machine, you need to look at overclocking at least to a basic degree via the motherboard. All the motherboards have some form of overclocking. You just need to make sure the vCore doesn't get pushed too high. Ideally, you want to sit at 1.35 if you can, maintaining at least 5 gig, or maybe even if you got the silicone lottery, maybe 5.1 on all cores. Now, the good thing about the Intel machine is that you can run Patriot Viper Steel. Now, you can run this RAM in even AMD machines, but you have to clock it down from the megahertz speed, but then you significantly reduce the timings in the secondaries as well. But with this board, it actually does have these Patriot Viper Steel RAMs in the QVL. So that's the other thing. If you're wanting to run different RAM, make sure you check the motherboard QVL. If you don't check the QVL to see if the RAM has been tested with at least a profile on there, then you may have trouble running the RAM just by sticking it in. It means that you're going to have to manually change the timings yourself to get the RAM to run, and that could be extremely painful if you don't know what you're doing. When it comes to these Patriot Viper Steels, they are extremely cheap Samsung B die with 1919, 1939, and they work perfectly. They should work perfectly in this board. If this motherboard struggles to handle this capacity, I would then be dropping it down to 4200. Now, the motherboard actually has a XMP profile for 4200, so that's extremely good if you're running both of these kits, because they're not actually by the vendor supported to run these two kits. They'll run like a 4x8 kit, which is then QVL tested if it's on the list. But these kits were not necessarily paired to work together. But because there's Samsung B die, your chances of that are significantly increased. And the fact that there is a profile for 4200 for this RAM means that you should have no problems at all sticking both of these in. And if you have trouble booting up or any issues, just run it at 4200 and away you go. We're only going a Gen 3 970 here, a Samsung 500 gig. You can increase that if you want, but because this is only Gen 3 compatible motherboard, there's no real point in going anything more. It's not going to help you by having a faster one to load EFT. This is far more than fast enough. And you can even use this too in the AMD machines if you want to save a bit of coin. So this could be a cost-cutting measure too. But this is sort of the basics. You know, you got your Windows, you got your EFT on there. You're sort of good to go. Obviously, in this case too, we've saved a bit of money, so we can easily go a 3070 here. While it's not necessarily PCI Gen 4, it's still fine. You will lose a little bit of performance for that, but it's not necessarily taxing Gen 3 all that much. So you're still safe to use this card. You just maybe get 1% lower performance, maybe a little bit more, depending on the title that you're playing. But it's really not going to make a big difference overall. It'll still be better to get the bigger card and go down that way. Like I said though, you can run other cards too. You can run like 2070 Supers, 2080 Supers, 2080 Ti's, 1080 Ti's. Obviously the 3000 series like 3060 and upwards should all run EFT quite well. Obviously the more CUDA cores and the more RAM that you've got, the better performance you potentially will get. But like I said, a ceiling has been placed where like even a 2080 Ti really can't really get you any more performance than say a 3080 or 3090. When it comes to the case, it's the same case, but choose your poison when it comes to the case, and same with the power supply. You can easily get away with a 850 here. It's only once you go up to say a 3080 or a 3090 that you really do need the 1000 watt. The reason why I had it in the AMD build before was because of just upgradability. That machine can be potentially used the next generation cards, whereas you are probably limited to not upgrading this machine for the next generation, as in it probably won't really, with the new technology coming out and what we've seen of the 4000 series from NVIDIA, that you'll want a board that supports Gen 4 next time, but you don't need it this time round. Alrighty, so the next machine that I want to talk about is actually my machine. This is the build that I ended up running. In the end, I've got a 5900X. Now, I didn't go the 5950X because it's overkill. Even as a content creator, I do rendering and stuff like that. For me, for what I need to do, the 5950X was, the 5900X was more than enough. The 5950X with the extra 4 cores is great for production, but it has a harder time being cooled. You've got an extra 4 cores on there, and with Precision Boost Overdrive, you don't have as much leeway from what I've seen from other people trying to undervolt them and stuff, that you really don't necessarily gain sort of the bang for buck that you do from, say, the 5800X, which actually probably has the better single core performance overall, as opposed to the 5900X. So I took the middle ground, having like the in-between of single core and multi-core performance, because I do stream and I'm on a single PC at the moment. And I thought this CPU could then in the long term potentially be a secondary streaming machine if I did upgrade. But the 5800X probably single core boosts with Precision Boost Overdrive and a fairly decent amount of cooling better. It just depends on silicon lottery on how well it will do. Same again here. I went with the 360 because I was obviously playing to undervolt as much as I possibly could. I actually ended up going the Unify because that allowed me to run this Patriot Viper Steel RAM. that I was talking about before, and then I was able to change my timing. So I'm actually running, my timings are 14, 15, 13, 31T, but kickdown mode's enabled. So that's just something to just be, that's sort of what you can do. I am running 37, 33. I couldn't get 3800. I probably could if I updated the BIOS now. But I might be limited just by my memory controller on the 5900X. So that's probably something too. You may be able to push a little bit harder on these RAMs, on these RAM sticks, if you have obviously the better silicon from the 5950X. But for the most part, try to actually learn memory timings and overclocking at least to a degree. You can get some really good deals. Obviously, if you don't want to go down that route, you just get some XMP RAM that we talked about earlier in the other builds. Plug that in and just set and forget. If you want to try and venture out, this is probably a really good entry-level way of like getting some really cheap Samsung B-die RAM, and then going down that path, and then trying to manually time and adjust some settings. There's a lot of guides about these RAM sticks here that I've mentioned, that if you want to have a look into. Someone to obviously that you can have a look at is someone called Buildzoid, and he's got a blog here, actual hardware, actual hardcore overclocking, and he's also got his own YouTube channel. I highly recommend you check it out. I'll leave a link in the description for this. He talks about all the different RAM sticks that you can use, and he's a big reason why my machine runs as well as I did. This is the guy that passes on a lot of his information to Gamer Nexus, so in my opinion, he does some really good stuff. His YouTube channel is very rambly, but doesn't mean that he's not talking about very relevant stuff. And yeah, if you can sit down through the actual videos, you will learn a lot of information. And that's probably, if you want to venture down that, that's probably where I'd start and see if you actually want to go down that path and give it a try, but knowing the fact that you will have to spend time getting these RAM sticks to work. They're not necessarily going to be plug and play, especially in a Ryzen machine, because the Infinity Fabric will not run over 4000, let alone 3800. So that's just something to be mindful of. Obviously, in this case, we got the 980 Pro back in, 1 terabyte. I did go the top of the line at the time, 3080, with the gaming OC Strix, purely for the fact that I wanted a card that would last. The Strix editions of cards seem to last the longest out of most of the cards that I've had, and as well with friends. So I wanted a video card that, one, was obviously going to perform as high as it could, but also two, would last me a very long time, that I could even pass it down to other machines. The Fantex case was the one that I liked the most. The default fans that it comes with are really good airflow, so I didn't need to necessarily invest in Noctua fans, even though I did have some available that from my old machine. I just had to get another 140 Noctua at the back, but you can probably get any 140 at the back to suit. But even with the 3 fans stock with no extra fans, is really good airflow for CPU and GPU. 1000 watts power supply from Corsair. Had really good experience with them, so that was a no-brainer. As you can see here, the price of this GPU is no longer 2000 what I pay for it. It's now 2800, and that's in Australia. So another $800 more, pretty much in the price range of a mid-tier 3090 when they first came out in Australia. Insane. The market's stuffed. I'm so glad I bought the card when I did. I managed to get one from Western Australia. Thank you, Ara Computers. And I got the very last one, and before the boom really kicked in to the point where the shortages started driving the prices up, and the manufacturing shortages, and etc. Now, the other thing I want to talk about now, guys, is the encoder settings for streaming. And this is with OBS Live, but more specifically, we're going to be eventually talking about a plugin called Streamfx by the user that created it, called Xaymar. He does a really good job of explaining the art of encoding with NVIDIA. And I'm going to leave a link to his blog post. I highly recommend you go through it and have it and absorb it. It will give you a really good understanding of what's capable of the NVENC encoder and the strides that it's made. So this is very much going to be tailored towards single PC streamers, as well as users that are not necessarily partner yet. So the biggest thing that I want to talk about is the output. So for the most part, if you've just got normal OBS settings, This is something that you're probably looking at. You'll have audio track 1 enabled. You'll have your encoder set to H.264 new. Now the rescale output. Now this is quite important. So you need to be either using 1664 by 936p. So 936p is a very common resolution. It's a derivative by 8 resolution. And it's actually here listed as like a HD resolution. So really good resolution to potentially be using. The other resolution and potentially slightly better resolution that is supported by the current bitrate limitations at the moment with Twitch is 864p, which is obviously 1536 by 864. So that's the two resolutions that I'd be looking at, and they're the ones I'm going to be talking about most in a single PC streaming setup. Now, coming back to OBS, now for the most part, you guys can actually run 8000 even if you're not partner. So the maximum cap that I've been able to read up on seems to be 8500, but that is not limited to being a partner. You can be an affiliate with Twitch and still run this bitrate. You probably can't exceed 8000, and that's even the limit that I run at as a Twitch partner, because the server, from the looks of it, from the packet layers that they actually look at, combined with the packets coming in for your stream and then the audio in there as well, they can only assess so much with a sort of a percentage leeway. But for the most part, from what I've seen from people testing it, as soon as they start breaching over 8500, so 8600-ish kilobytes, then the stream potentially starts dropping out. If you stay around 8000, that should be enough float to, and with your audio set at 320 bit to 320 kbps to obviously stay within the range where you will not be dropped by Twitch. But you don't need to be a partner for that. So if you're currently an affiliate and you're still using 6000, definitely buff that guy up to 8000 and see how your stream goes. It'll be a significant improvement. With the keyframe intervals, just with stock OBS, I'd probably only run this at 2. Ideally, you want to run it at 1.5 to get low latency mode, but you can't do that with the stock OBS. You'll need to use a plugin from Xaymar, which is your StreamFX plugin, and we'll dive into that later on. But this is just for settings in case you want to just try the extra bit rate with your current settings. This is what you need to do. Max quality is also enabled. Profile for the preset, for the profile, go high. Look ahead. Look, there's two options. Xaymar recommends maximum max B frames at 3 with look ahead enabled, and also Psycho visual tuning enabled. A lot of streamers for Escape from Tarkov recommend keyframes 2, look ahead off, the Psycho visual tuning to turn on. That's quite important, as it will, in motion, it'll take bitrate away from, say, like the grass when it's in motion, and then apply it to images which are not in motion to potentially maintain as much quality as it can while trying not to cause blockiness. And more giving it a bit of a gloss over effect, especially over grass, which is quite important in Escape from Tarkov. GPU you want 0, but then the max B frames you want at 2. So it's entirely up to you which way you want to go. These are some of the settings that are normally being used, but I would probably recommend Xaymar's settings at going 3, enabling look ahead as well. And then that's pretty much it. See how the 8000 bitrate goes. If you do find you're having dropouts because maybe your bitrate is fluctuating too much and it is kicking you, maybe try like 7900 or then 7800, and then see how it goes. If you're still having problems there, try 7500. But for the most part, I've had other users try 8000 and they seem to be holding quite steadily. All right, and lastly, guys, the next thing I want to talk about is going to be the settings that I use for my streams with the StreamFX plugin. Now, you will need to obviously download the StreamFX plugin following the guides from Xaymar's post. And then once you've installed the StreamFX plugin, you will be able to go over to your stream output and then streaming. And then you're going to have a new option here under the encoder called FFmpeg. And this will give you custom encoder settings that you can use for your stream. So this is the guide that and the settings that I'm using here right now are pretty much exactly the same as what it's pretty much exactly the same as what Xaymar's recommended. So we're using high quality preset, the profile's high, levels 4.2, high quality constant bitrate, 2-pass is enabled, look ahead is 32. Now I should warn you too, 2-pass is enabled for 2000 NVIDIA cards and beyond. If you have a 10,000 or lower, oh sorry, not 10,000, 1,000 or lower, so like 30, so 1080 Ti or lower, then you will not have to, you can't enable this. So these settings are mostly specifically targeted for the newer NVENC encoder from the 2000 cards and onwards. And even here, you will actually have different settings to use if you actually have the Pascal or Maxwell. So just be mindful that you need to have Turing or Ampere to use these settings that I'm recommending. Otherwise, you're going to have to use the older settings. Continuing on from that, look ahead is set to 32. Adaptive iframes is disabled. Adaptive B-frames is enabled. The bitrate is what we talked about earlier, where we can set 8,000 even if you're not a partner, and use the buffer size as 16,000, which is double. Okay, when we're going to spatial adaptive strength, you obviously want to enable it and then set it to 12, and this is recommended by Xaymar. Now, if you want to run something similar to what OBS has stock via Psycho tuning, which is the similar setting for this, is you just put it to 8. And then, yeah, go from there. But you can actually manually control it here, either less or more. But leave it at 12 and see how it goes. 12 seems to be a good number, especially in Escape from Tarkov. This will help in grassy scenarios. It'll pull bitrate away from the grass and then smooth it over. So that's just something to just be mindful of. Other options here for maximum B-frames, just leave that one at 3. And then from there on, these are the default settings that Xaymar recommends. Only use middle B-frames as reference. Zero latency is disabled. Weighted prediction disabled. Non-reference P-frames is enabled. And access unit delimiter is default. Okay, so the other two options that I want to talk about is keyframes. I would set this at 1.5 seconds. That's for low latency mode that's been discovered by Xaymar. And then I would enable low latency mode within Twitch. That will give you the best response time for about 1 to 2 seconds. You can't normally do this in default OBS. It won't let you select 1.5. It'll either say 1 second or 2 seconds. So if you want to actually enable that, that's what you've got to do. Now with the custom settings here with the refs equals 5. Now for 936p, it's going to be the number 5. If you're going to go 864p, it's going to be ref 6. Now that would be the limit of the ref commands that I would use. I wouldn't go above 6. So if you're going to go 720p, you would go refs 9. But iPhones or iOS devices, more specifically iPhones, will potentially have playback issues. So that's just something to just be mindful of. And even in Xaymar's guide, he does cover that a little bit. And if you want to look at other reses, there is the Bible where you can actually calculate what the other is. It's not easy. You're going to have to actually dig around and actually figure it out for yourself. But these are the token rev commands that have already been mentioned, either by myself or by Xaymar. Once you're going through that, guys, that's pretty much the core of it, of what you're going to be needing to try. Give that a whirl and see how it actually unfolds in game. Now, the other thing I would recommend too is in the advanced tab, your color space should be set to 709. Obviously, the color format is NV12, and your color range should be partial. If you do have full in there running these settings, I did notice that on Twitch that certain users had, especially on Chrome, had issues watching the stream. So that's just something to just be mindful of, that if you run partial color range, that could alleviate that scenario. And that's pretty much it, guys. That's sort of the basics of the settings required for streaming that I'd recommend using currently for Escape from Tarkov. So hopefully this overall guide has been a benefit to you. If you have any questions, please leave a comment down below. And if you got anything out of this video, I really appreciate a like. It really means a lot to me. I do stream on Twitch Sundays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, starting around 8 p.m. UTC plus 10. It'll be really good to see you guys there. And if you got any follow-up questions, I'm happy to help. Join the Discord too, and then I'll probably have even a channel set up if you want some tech questions to be answered, or if you've got any sort of queries about purchasing advice. I'm sure the community or even myself will be happy to help you out, and then go from there. Also too, guys, if you find someone that you've got benefit from this, if you've got a friend or someone that you could share this with, it would really mean a lot to me if you could pass it on to them, just so that I could get some traction in this video. It would really mean the world to me. Anyway, guys, thanks for watching, and until next time, I'll see you back out there.